What's going on, guys? Aaron from Top Tier Gaming here, and today I am bringing you a tier list for June of 2022, sort of talking about the best decks going into this month. And I guess, this is the very start of the month, so the rest, we're going to be going off of essentially May, YCS Hartford, a couple of regionals, including ones I've been to give you some hands-on experience with what the format actually looks like when you're down at the tables of a regional. Because I just went to one and actually got top 4 at the Fort Worth Regional, which was 505 players, so almost essentially YCS Fort Worth is what it felt like. But yeah, just going over what I think some of the best decks for this upcoming month is going to be with this new meta, which, recently the biggest thing that happened was, of course, Albaz came out previously, and then Dimension Force is definitely the biggest thing that happened other than that. So coming up, we also have the Marincess set, which will be the water support. Mostly Marincess is going to be the meta impact thing in that set, which Marincess is actually not on this tier, but I will go ahead and tier it after I do all of these. But yeah, without further ado, let's get straight into this tier list, and we're going to be starting off with Dinosaur. Dinosaur, very interesting. I do think one of the biggest shifts that happened this format is going into it. Initially, hand traps were really bad. With the past, well, I still ran hand traps because I play a lot of decks like Evil Twin, and I really like hand traps. But the general consensus, especially with the Despia builds, were that hand traps were being played less. And I felt like Dinosaur kind of took benefit from that. Now with hand traps coming back in more, it's so weird because some hand traps are really bad against Dinosaur. But I'm definitely going to put this in Rogue. I mean, this deck hasn't really been putting up, successful numbers anywhere. But I do think it is a Rogue crushing deck. I do think the strength of this deck is very good in that when it goes off, it's strong. But it generally just has a little bit of a harder time. So it's kind of where we're at with Dinosaur. Alistair, I think Alistair's pretty good, Invoked. And I guess it depends which Invoked you're talking about, right? There's Invoked Dogmatica, there's Shaddoll stuff, and there's also Invoked Branded. Now, there's 3 branded variants that exist within these decks. So, if we're talking about Invoked Branded, I'd still put that in tier 2, and that's maybe where I would put Invoked right now in general. So, nothing too crazy there. I think Alistair, Mechaba plus hand traps, Mechaba Mirror Jade plus hand traps is always really strong. It's definitely consistent. It's another one-card engine hand trap deck, like Evil Twin, like Marincess, like Salad. A lot of those are going to find themselves here, but some I do think are better than others. However, I'm going to put Alistair in tier 2. Regular Despia, definitely is still a tier 1 deck in my opinion going into this month. It has fallen off, if you don't keep up with Yu-Gi-Oh content very often, Despia did fall off a little bit from the start of the meta. This was predicted to be almost purely Despia when Despia got announced. We were expecting OCG numbers a little bit, but here it really turned into more of a Sword Soul versus Despia type meta. But with Hartford and the last few regionals I went to, we are in one of the most diverse formats we've been in a long time, to be honest. This is a pretty diverse format, and Despia did seem to drop off a little bit due for just almost for the reason that other decks are being played more. So Despia is still very strong, still an insanely powerful deck, still something to really prepare for this format, but definitely not maybe what we thought it was going to be. Predaplant Despia, I'm actually going to put in tier 1.5. If you saw Jesse Cotton, Pack, and a lot of good players like DB Grinder was on it as well, Predaplant Despia was a really strong pick going into Hartford because less people knew what it did, and it was, it's new, and it's got some stuff it can do. It's a really strong, almost meta call because of its good Despia matchup. However, I feel without sort of the surprise factor and the novelty that this deck brings, the actual strength of the deck isn't anything past what Despia I think is already doing. I do think Predaplanting is an amazing card, but I don't know if I will say it's as good as Despia. Time will tell. Maybe the Predaplant version will take off in some, popularity over here in the TCG, but I'm mostly thinking that it's a little bit weaker than Despia when you take a look at the overall format, but maybe that's just me. Next, we're going to take a look at Adignister, which I think Adignister also finds itself somewhere in tier 2 or tier 1.5 for the same reason. Again, Alistair, Evil Twin, Salamangreat, they're all the one-card engine hand trap decks, which are always very, very strong picks, and you can always do well with these. But Adagnister does seem a little bit better because Despia in particular have a very hard time outing the Arrival Cybers, right? Like, I think this one might be a better meta call than the other one-card engine hand trap decks. However, hand traps are coming back into the format, and this deck gets hit by everything. Like, a lot of the hand trap decks do. Like, Evil Twin, for example, gets hit by almost every hand trap. But this one, anything on Dark Templar might just be the end of its career, and that's always been the struggle with this deck. But I do think Adagnister is particularly good, so I'm going to place it there. Sword Soul, definite tier 1. I think this deck is crazy. I did just get top 4 with it at Fort Worth. And when you looked at the top tables at Fort Worth Regional, it was just Sword Soul. Like, round 8 or 9, you look at the top 16, and there was like 9 Sword Soul there. There was like a couple Despia, a couple Flunder, a couple Drytron, but it was so much Sword Soul. And yeah, I think this deck is obviously tier 1. With hand traps becoming more prevalent in the meta, I do think this deck will drop off a little in like its strength because it can't go for the same plays it was going for before, and it gets interrupted more often. But I don't think that's going to make it not tier 1, so we're still placing it there. Drytron, this is an interesting one, and this might be a hot take. I think this is going to be a very hot take. I'm putting Drytron in tier 1. This deck is by no means like a very popular deck, this format. I don't think by popularity and numbers it's showing that you would think it's a tier 1 deck. Also with, you know, hand traps coming back into the meta, that could be reason to put this in tier 1.5, so I do want to put like an asterisk on this tier 1 pick. However, despite all that, what Drytron like is doing right now with Vanity's Ruler plus the Magic-y counter trap, if you go that route, there's the Scythe route, there's the Amorphage route, there's 3 different Drytron variants essentially. And all of them are good. So Fort Worth Regional, the one I just went to, Drytron actually took first place. And there was one at the top tables consistently besides the guy who got first place. I do think Drytron is really, really good. And I think, you know, their go first is crazy. And honestly, I think Drytron is really powerful and really slept on. But, you know, the more Droll comes into the meta, which it is, I think eventually this could end up being a tier 1.5. But just going into it right now, I do think Drytron's actually really good. It's tough putting it in tier 1, I think. But I almost think it's better than tier 1.5. I think this deck is like a sleeper pick. Okay, so I'm going to preface it. I'm going to put a final statement on it. If we're talking about numbers, I'm going to put it at 1.5 essentially because it's not that popular. If we're talking about strength, I'm going to put it in tier 1, which I think is a hot take, but I think this deck's like really, really good. Eldritch, branded Eldritch and regular Eldritch, I think they both find themselves in 1.5 right now. I know this is looking weird with Drytron above Eldritch, but I did say it was going to be a hot take. I think the deck is phenomenal right now. Eldritch, I think, is falling off a little bit. Also, something to talk about Drytron is this deck plays Mystic Mine better than almost any other deck. And unfortunately, Mystic Mine is almost the name of the game this format currently. Because you're not siding in back row hate for Drytron, so they just Mystic Mine you and you lose. It's actually so toxic. That's something for that's something for Drytron. And Eldritch, I just generally think is a little weaker right now. It's still a strong strategy. Traps are still good. But branded Eldritch, I feel, is like a lot worse than branded Despia. Or even the branded Predaplant. So I just am not going to put the Golden Lord at tier 1 this time. Flunder. Okay, so Earth Machine. Earth Machine is like a really good deck. And, okay. I'm going to give a real rating. I hate to do it, but Flunder, I'm going to put, oh my gosh, no, I don't want to do it. No, I don't want to put it in tier 1. Don't make me. Guys, I do not like this deck. I don't like talking about this deck, but when this deck is playing, it is the best deck in the room. I'm telling you, when this deck has its engine rolling, it is here so easily. It's just the best deck when its engine is rolling. There's so few outs for this deck. And with Despia falling off a little bit, that means Zombie World is also falling off a little bit. I kind of want to put it in 1.5 still, but like, this deck has been doing so well at regionals, just getting so many tops actually. 4th place at Fort Worth was actually the Fluanderese guy I beat. I don't know, like this deck is just so bonkers. See, this is how you know I don't go into these tier lists already knowing where I'm placing these decks, because it pains me to put it as a 1.5 because I think it's like actually one of the best contenders right now, but also I hate this deck, so I'm going to put it in tier 1. I don't know. There's going to be a lot of tier 1 decks. Earth Machine, I'm putting in tier 1.5. With the release of Regulus, this deck got a huge buff which I think helps it a lot. It's really strong. It does really well consistently, even getting a couple of regional tops. But I do think that it's not as good as the decks above it, essentially, and that's why I'm putting it at 1.5. Virtual World. Virtual World actually did really good in a European National, I think. Or maybe it was like just a big event in Europe. I remember seeing one of Lithium's videos talk about it. And, you know, Virtual World has been sleeping most of the time. I'm going to put it in Rogue despite some of its success. I think the deck is good, and I think the Punk stuff can help it a lot if you decide to play like a Punk variant. But honestly, like, yeah, I just don't want to call it tier 2, to be honest. It's just not seeing the play. Prank Kids are gone. They're non-existent. This deck is dead. It's not a deck. PK, I'm going to put in tier 2. I think Phantom Knight, I mean, like, playability right now, I think they're a little better than Dinosaur and Virtual World for sure. They're not the Scythe deck they used to be, right? Without Verite Anaconda, DPE, you know, they're missing a big point of interruption, and they're missing some of their follow-up. But if you guys don't remember, like, Phantom Knight before DPE were actually doing pretty well. And they still have, like, the Brave Engine, which is fine in the deck if they don't go the Tour Guide route. Honestly, me personally, I think, like, combo Phantom Knight, like, before Destroy Phoenix Enforcer came out, is, like, still a pretty good deck. Like, if you're not going for, like, Dagda and Verite, remember, that's 4 monsters that you can, like, use for other things now. So now they can go for, like, not Hope Harbinger, Draco Dragon, Draconic Dragon, F-Zero, the F-Zero guy. They can go for that. They can actually go for, like, IP with Dante plays. They can go for Time Thief Redoer, and they have Fog Blades to back it up with follow-up. Like, I've always thought this deck, while it can, like, the gas version can play through hand traps, and it can also set up some crazy boards. Like, I think this is actually a strong tier 2 deck, and I'm not counting out PK despite everything. Like, that deck is still pretty good. Dinomorphia, I'm going to be talking about pure rather than branded, and honestly, I think it's 1.5. I'm put it in 2. I'm going to put it in tier 2. I think Dinomorphia is the best trap deck in the meta, personally. I think Eldritch has a lot of, you know, points there as well. But I think Dinomorphia, like, low-key is so powerful. Like, I play the deck a lot. Rexstrom boosted this deck beyond. Like, Rexstrom as a card is like a tier 1 card. Like, that card on board is just beyond broken. And, like, the deck has so many in-engine outs to what trap decks normally lose to. But I don't know. I don't want to put it at 1.5. I don't think it right now is seeing the playability. One of the biggest reasons I'm not putting this deck in tier 1.5 is Despia, essentially. Masquerade is this deck's worst nightmare. Okay, Super Poly and Masquerade. Oh, this deck does not like them. So because Despia is tier 1, I'm going to put Dinomorphia in tier 2. If Despia was not tier 1, I would put Dinomorphia in tier 1.5. Essentially, that's how this is going to be. Dragon Link, I'll put it in 1.5, 2. It's like the line between these are just so thin, but Dragon Link has really fallen off a little bit with Despia getting the dragon guy and Super Poly being so prevalent in the meta. Like, with Despia being, you know, in a number 1 slot, well, I'm going to actually put Sword Soul above Despia personally, but with Despia being so good, it makes me like Dragon Link less. I know the deck is still really powerful, and maybe you could even say it's better than Earth Machine. Maybe you could say it's better than Branded Eldritch. I feel like putting Dragon Link in tier 2 makes some of the consistencies with this list a little weird. But I just don't see it doing as well as it used to, right? Like, I'm going to put it in tier 2. Like, I don't think it's had the... While it's been having a decent amount of play, like, if you look on Highlighter Dueling Book or, you know, just Dueling Book videos in general, like, Dragon Link does get play, but I don't think it's amazing. So, I'm going to put it in tier 2. Salad got a huge boost. I'm going to put this in tier 2 as well. It's, like, up there with, you know, the Alistair stuff, and, like, it's the same thing with Adignister. The thing about Salamangreat right now is, one, they got Heat Soul, which I think is a good option in the deck. It doesn't have to revolve around Heat Soul like Code Talker does, but I do think that Heat Soul is an option for the deck. It also, you know, it's playing Ibly now, and it got a lot of its cards back. I think Salad's really good, but personally, I don't see it being better than Adignister currently. I feel like its end board is, you know, less good than Adignister. And because of Adignister's potential draw 3, I think sometimes it even sees more hand traps than Salad, even with Heat Soul. I think this deck plays through a little more, and it has the, you know, I think Adagnister is actually better than Salad right now, so I'll put Salad in tier 2. Skye Striker. All right, so this might be another hot take because Skye Striker, it won the YCS for the fact that it was on Mystic Mine better than anyone else. It did win YCS Hartford, so I think a lot of people watching this right now will be just like, oh, put it in tier 1 because it just won Hartford. That means it's like one of the best decks. I'm not really feeling that. Personally, I just don't see Striker as like the best deck. I think it plays Mystic Mine really well, but the more people are prepared for that, like the Mystic Mine strategy of it all gets a little weaker. And some of the reason it did well was because it was running Trap Trick for D-Barrier, and that's because these two are probably the best decks, which makes D-Barrier insane. And like, Skye Striker does well at events, it's been doing well, but if you look like regional reports, it's just been doing well. It hasn't been a tier 1 contender. The only showing that would make you think this deck is tier 1 is Hartford, in my opinion. So like, I think Skye Striker is awesome, maybe even the best of tier 1.5, but I personally don't think it's a tier 1 deck. So, I mean, I think this and Tron are probably the hottest takes on the list, but it did win Hartford. Like, congrats to, Poe for winning Hartford with Skye Striker. Amazing feat. Skye Striker is, a cool deck. Ray is, a waifu. So, great for Skye Striker, but I'm not putting it in tier 1 personally. Tri-Brigade, I think, is strong tier 2. I actually really like Tri-Brigade. I'm considering playing it heavily, which, now I don't really like to play meta decks often. Sword Soul was an unusual deck for me to play, even though I enjoyed it. Tri-Brigade, it's no longer meta anymore, and I'm looking at it, and it's got some cool stuff going on, especially with Albion and Mercurier, and, things Tri-Brigade wasn't doing in Tri-Brigade format. I think this is a strong tier 2 deck. The Bird Up version, or even just, like, the branded version. You're not playing Branded Fusion anymore, Verite's banned, but I don't know. I think Tri-Brigade is a good tier 2. It can play a lot of hand traps, like the one-card engine hand trap decks, but it doesn't, like, one-card engine as well as theirs, so yeah, I think Tri-Brigade is really good, but I don't think it's as good as Adagnister right now, essentially. Pendulum. This one's a hard one to rank. I think when this deck is playing and being played by a pilot that knows what they're doing, this deck is one of the best combo decks in the room, and it just got a huge consistency boost. It got extra Pendulum as well, which I don't even know if they play. I haven't seen any updated Pendulum lists. But Beyond the Pendulum's a crazy card, and I think, honestly, the boost it gave to Pendulums is huge. I'm going to put it in tier 2 because it hasn't done anything, but I do think the strength of this deck is much more than people are giving it credit for. Of course, everyone who watches Triff, they know Pendulum, right? A lot of people watch Triff. You guys know Pendulum is good when he pilots it and he has these crazy boards, but as far as, like, how it feels with the average, Yu-Gi-Oh player, the good Pendulum players make this deck look good, right? But I think most of the time, tier 2, maybe even Rogue, because it just hasn't been putting any numbers up, but I'll put it in tier 2. There's way more Rogue than this, but the list just doesn't have things I like to put in Rogue, like Evil Twin's not here. A lot of the decks I play aren't here now that I'm looking at it, because I play a lot of Rogue decks, Trap Tricks, Madolche, they're not on the list, but I'd put those in tier 2. DDD, I'm putting in tier 2. Like, this deck did really good, and that's great. It did good at the YCS. It got a top 32 slot. And I think this deck fell off a little bit from initially, I'd say like a month and a half ago. This deck was actually poised to be like a tier 1 deck. Like, people were really hyping this deck up, and it just didn't really come to that. And, I think it's weak to a lot of things right now. So I'll put it in tier 2. This tier 2 list is huge, and usually you'd have more Rogue here. So some of these tier 2 slots could maybe go in Rogue if you were being a little bit more strict with this list. Okay, so there's a picture of Ogre Dance right here. Final one on the list besides Marincess, which I'll talk about in a second. Ogre Dance is going to be representing the Punk archetype, which the Punk archetype is more of an engine. So you could rank like the Punk engine here, but it actually has almost its own deck now. It's like the Punk Brave Therion deck is what we're going to talk about, which is sort of, in my opinion, like an evolution from like the Sun Avalon Therion deck, which, speaking of, Sun Avalon's not on this list. I'd put Sun Avalon in 1.5 right now. Just to mention that, I know like a lot of people glossed over that because they just sort of skip in the video to see where I placed everything. I'd put Sun Avalon in 1.5, but this is going to be like the Brave Punk Therion deck. Like, that's what this is going to be. and I think it has the potential to be tier 1. It just did super well at YCS Hartford, and not like Skye Striker, where one player successfully carried it. Like maybe it got 2 or 3 top 32s. I don't know the full 32 breakdown, but I know it got first place. And even though it got like one first place, like one guy carried it to the top. This Punk deck actually took up so many slots in the top 32. I think it was like the second most represented deck, like in top 32, Sword Soul and this deck were the second most represented. And it was all sort of just like the Hulk turbo pile, you know, ban every card deck. It took more slots than Despia, right? So I think this deck is super strong, and it's something you have to prepare for, so I'm putting it in tier 1. It has had the least time of being a deck this format because Therions are brand new for the rest of the stuff on this list, but yeah, I think this deck's like super good, so I'm gonna put it in tier 1. Talking about Marincess after the support, I'm gonna put it essentially where Adagnister is. I think it's going to be one of the better tier 1.5 decks. Like, I truthfully think that Marincess is a crazy deck with the new support, with so many more options than it used to have. And, you know, essentially, it can play like 18 hand traps, and it can run a lot of good engine pieces with decent extenders now because like Spring Girl and the spell card. I think it will be just like where Adagnister is. It's a 1-card hand trap deck, and I think those are always strong. Like, this is either tier 1.5 or tier 2 is also where I'd put Evil Twin, essentially. But yeah, that is going to wrap it up for this tier list. Let me know what you guys think down below in the comments below. How you would rank this list differently, right? Like, there's a bunch of different ways you could go with this. But this is sort of my opinions right now. I think the hottest takes are probably Tron and Skye Striker in tier 1.5, because I already see the comments like, hey, Striker just won Hartford. How is it a 1.5 deck? And, you know, maybe Flunder in tier 1 is a hot take, but I do think this deck is crazy and being played more than it should be right now. But yeah, this is going to be it for the tier list. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, like and subscribe. This has been Aaron from Top Tier Gaming. Bye, YouTube.